On a snowy night in a quiet American town, a police officer came home to find his little girl kneeling on the cold kitchen floor, clutching her baby brother as tears mixed with spilled milk. Beside her, their loyal German shepherd stood guard, refusing to back down. What unfolded next would change their lives forever. Would you have noticed the hidden pain behind a child's eyes? Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from today? Drop your city or country in the comments. I'd love to know. And may your day be filled with warmth and peace wherever you are. The town of Crestwood lay under a heavy quilt of snow that February evening, its narrow streets hushed, the rooftops carrying thick ridges of white that seemed to press the world downward. The wind drifted through the pine groves like a restless spirit, carrying with it the smell of chimney smoke and faint traces of iron from the frozen river. Patrol cars had already returned to the precinct, and only a few lights flickered in diners along Main Street, the rest of the town surrendering to winter's silence. Into this quiet came the measured crunch of boots on snow and the steady breath of a man who had carried too much weight for too long. Daniel Cross, 38 years old, a police officer of Crestwood's department, walked toward his home on the edge of town with a weariness that clung to his broad frame like frost. Daniel was tall, 6'2", shoulders square and hardened from years of duty. His short dark hair streaked faintly with gray at the temples. His hazel eyes, often mistaken for coldness, carried a perpetual shadow, born not from the job alone, but from a personal loss that still clung to him like a wound. Less than a year ago, his wife Sarah had died from complications after giving birth to their son Caleb, and since then, the man who had once laughed easily had become a figure of rigid silence, burying grief beneath routines of work and discipline. Sarah Cross had been a woman of uncommon warmth, tall and willowy, with dark auburn hair that fell to her shoulders and a smile that neighbors remembered as steady sunlight. She had grown up the daughter of a carpenter, accustomed to hard winters and small sacrifices, and those lessons had shaped her into someone both resilient and tender. She worked as a nurse in the Crestwood Community Clinic, known for her gentleness with children and her stubbornness when it came to fighting for her patients' needs. Years earlier, during a flu outbreak that overwhelmed the clinic, Sarah had worked through nights without sleep, holding frightened hands and comforting parents. That experience had deepened her empathy, and those who knew her said she could not walk past suffering without intervening. Her death left a void not only in Daniel, but in the community itself, and her absence haunted the walls of their house like an unfinished melody. After her passing, Daniel had tried to fill the emptiness with structure and order. He had remarried quickly, perhaps too quickly, to Victoria Hayes. Victoria, 35, was striking in appearance, with carefully styled blonde hair, porcelain skin, and blue eyes that seemed to calculate as much as they charmed. She dressed immaculately, preferring silk dresses and perfumes that lingered in a room long after she left. To neighbors, she was polite, articulate, and poised, but beneath that flawless veneer lurked a brittleness, a sense of entitlement sharpened by years of ambition. She had once worked as an event planner in Denver, where appearances were currency, and she had carried that philosophy into her new marriage. To Victoria, the Cross household was a stage upon which she could orchestrate her image, but children, in their unpredictability and vulnerability, were obstacles she resented rather than embraced. The Cross family's German shepherd, Ranger, was 6 years old, a loyal companion with black and silver fur thickened by the winter. He had joined Daniel when still a pup, originally trained in basic K-9, obedience though never formally serving with the department. Ranger's intelligence was sharp, his ears pricking at the faintest sound, and his amber eyes carried the steady awareness of a guardian always evaluating threat and safety. He adored Sarah, often curling at her feet in the evenings, and after her passing, the dog's demeanor had grown more protective, particularly toward the children. To Emma and baby Caleb, Ranger was not only a pet, but a living shield, a presence that made the dark house seem less empty. Emma Cross, 7 years old, bore the soft brown hair of her mother and the storm-gray eyes of her father. She was slender, with a delicateness that made her seem almost translucent in the winter light, but her spirit, though quiet, held a resilience far beyond her years. She had been close to Sarah, following her mother around the kitchen and copying her mannerisms, and after the loss, Emma's silence became her defense. She rarely spoke unless necessary, clutching her baby brother close, as if the duty of protecting him had somehow fallen on her small shoulders. Caleb, not yet a year old, was a fragile child, often coughing in the cold air, with pale cheeks and tufts of dark hair that curled like his father's. His laughter was rare but precious, like the first bird call in early spring. On that evening, as Daniel trudged up the snow-dusted steps of the house, his boots heavy, he noticed something unusual: silence. Normally at this hour, he would hear Emma's soft voice murmuring to Caleb or the faint static of the television, but the house seemed too still. He shook off his uniform coat, the navy wool darkened by snowflakes, and hung it by the door. His duty belt he placed carefully on the entry table, the holster gleaming faintly under the yellow lamp. Ranger padded in beside him, ears alert, tail stiff with a wariness Daniel couldn't yet place. As he stepped into the living room, the sight of the empty blue couch unsettled him. That couch had become Emma's post, where she waited each evening with Caleb in her lap, eyes fixed on the door, until Daniel returned. Tonight it sat abandoned, a knitted blanket bunched on one side, Caleb's toy lying discarded on the floor. Daniel frowned, his hand tightening on the back of a chair. The stillness pressed harder now, accompanied by a faint metallic clink from the kitchen. Ranger's body stiffened, a low growl beginning in his chest. Daniel followed quickly, his polished black shoes tapping against the hardwood floor until he reached the doorway of the kitchen. The scene froze him. Emma was kneeling in a puddle of spilled milk on the cold tile, her thin dress clinging damply to her small frame. Her arms wrapped around Caleb, who cried hoarsely, his tiny fists clutching at her hair. Above them, Victoria stood, a porcelain cup still in her hand, her expression twisted with irritation rather than remorse. Her silk blouse was immaculate, her nails painted a deep red that glimmered under the light, but her voice cut sharp as broken glass. "You think you can take without asking? Do you know what disobedience costs in this house?" she snapped, her tone laced with venom. Emma's voice trembled, small and fragile. "I'm sorry. I only wanted my little brother to have a full stomach." Before Victoria could raise the cup again, Ranger lunged forward, his bark exploding through the room like thunder. His teeth bared, the fur along his spine bristled, and his body planted between the children and the stepmother. Victoria flinched, stepping back instinctively, her flawless composure cracking for the first time. Daniel's voice tore through the air, deeper and harsher than the storm outside. "What are you doing, Victoria? Put that down right now." The cup slipped from her fingers and clattered onto the counter. In that single moment, the fragile balance of the Cross household began to tilt, and the silence of winter no longer felt like peace, but like the breath before an avalanche. Daniel's voice still echoed through the kitchen long after the silence returned. Victoria had placed the cup aside, her face pale but quickly recovering into the practiced mask of elegance. She murmured excuses. "Emma misunderstood. I only meant to discipline her." But Daniel's sharp eyes saw through the performance. Ranger stood immovable, a wall of fur and muscle, his body shielding Emma and Caleb as though the very house itself had been compromised. The storm outside beat against the windows, wind howling as if in agreement with the chaos within. Daniel forced himself to step back, his chest tight with rage he dared not unleash in front of the children. He lifted Emma and Caleb gently, drying them with a towel, his hands trembling at the sight of his daughter's damp hair clinging to her cheeks. Caleb whimpered, then nestled against his father's chest, still hiccuping from his cries. Emma clutched the hem of his uniform sleeve as if it were a lifeline. Later that night, when the house had grown quiet, Daniel sat alone in the den with only Ranger by his side. The German shepherd rested his great head against Daniel's knee, amber eyes steady, ears twitching whenever a board creaked upstairs. Daniel reached for the small box on the bookshelf, the one he had avoided opening for months. Inside were keepsakes of Sarah. He pulled out a photo, its edges worn, showing Sarah standing in the garden on a spring afternoon, sunlight spilling across her auburn hair. Her tall, slender frame had always carried an ease that made others comfortable, and her gentle nature had drawn people toward her like moths to light. Yet it had been her determination that Daniel admired most. He remembered one summer when a measles outbreak swept through Crestwood. The local clinic was overwhelmed, and Sarah, then a nurse, had volunteered double shifts for weeks, refusing to rest. Her shoes had worn thin, her body weakened, but she never stopped comforting frightened children. That crisis had marked her forever. She often told Daniel that children's eyes told truths no adult words could ever match. Now, in the flicker of the lamplight, Daniel replayed her last recording. Sarah's voice, weary but tender, whispered through the small speaker. "If I am no longer here, promise me you'll protect the light in Emma's eyes. She will speak through them. Don't let that light go out." Daniel lowered his head, gripping the photo frame so tightly his knuckles whitened. He had thought burying himself in work and duty would honor her, but seeing Emma tonight, drenched in milk and fear, he realized he had broken that promise. Ranger shifted closer, pressing his warm body against Daniel's leg as though to remind him he was not alone. Meanwhile, Victoria was already preparing her next act. To the neighbors, she played the role of devoted stepmother. The following morning, Mrs. Ellen Carter, a retired teacher in her late 60s with soft white curls and a penchant for baking pies, stopped by with a tin of cookies. Victoria greeted her at the door, wrapped in a wool coat and scarf, her voice honeyed. She praised Emma's intelligence, spoke of how challenging it had been to manage the household after Sarah's death, and even allowed Caleb to be seen in her arms for a brief moment, cooing sweetly. Ellen Carter, though kind, was not easily fooled. She had taught generations of children and knew when a smile hid unease. She noticed Emma standing silently in the hallway, her dress too thin for winter, her eyes downcast. "She seems a little pale," Ellen remarked gently. Victoria's response was quick, smooth, and dismissive. "Oh, she's just shy." "You know how children are," Ellen left soon after, unsettled but unsure of what she had witnessed. Emma watched her go, pressing her small hand against Ranger's back as if to steady herself. Ranger's ears flicked, and his gaze followed Victoria with suspicion, every instinct telling him that the harmony shown to outsiders was a lie. Emma's days grew heavier. Victoria rationed food under the guise of teaching discipline, often giving Emma smaller portions while she herself dined richly. The girl learned to hide her hunger, taking bread crusts from plates, sipping water when her stomach ached. At school, her movements slowed, her frame thinner with each week. Yet she remained protective of Caleb, rocking him when he cried, whispering soft words Sarah once used. It was as though Emma believed her mother's spirit lingered in the phrases she remembered. Daniel noticed fragments, Emma's silence at dinner, the way she flinched when Victoria's shadow passed, how Ranger refused to leave her side. But each time he tried to confront Victoria, she wrapped herself in explanations. "You know how children exaggerate." She refuses to listen. "I'm only trying to teach her manners." Her voice would soften, her blue eyes wide with innocence, and Daniel, exhausted from long shifts, often deferred the battle. Still, the memory of Sarah's plea gnawed at him. The subplot of the town's watchful eyes began to weave in quietly. Pastor Mitchell, a broad-shouldered man in his 50s with graying beard and warm baritone voice, spoke briefly with Daniel outside the station. He remarked that Emma hadn't sung in Sunday school recently, something she once loved. Mitchell, known for his compassion, placed a hand on Daniel's arm. "Children withdraw when they carry burdens too heavy. Watch her closely." The words lingered long after Daniel walked away, echoing like Sarah's own warning. That night, Emma sat in her room, clutching a faded scarf of her mother's. Caleb slept fitfully in the crib beside her, whimpering in dreams. She whispered promises into the fabric, promises to keep him safe, to keep her mother's memory alive. Ranger lay stretched at the doorway, his body a barrier against the world beyond. The house was warm with firelight, but inside Emma's chest, the chill of hunger and fear refused to thaw. Downstairs, Victoria practiced her smile in the mirror, rehearsing her lines for the next social visit. To the outside world, she was flawless. But within the walls of the Cross household, the cracks widened, and the light in Emma's eyes flickered dangerously close to fading. The morning sun in Crestwood barely rose above the mountains, casting long shadows across the snow-drifted streets. The schoolyard of Crestwood Elementary crackled with the sounds of children, bundled in scarves and mittens, their laughter a fragile defiance against the winter air. Among them, Emma Cross stood apart. Her coat, though once warm, was now too small, the sleeves riding up her wrists, the hem frayed. She carried her brother's toy bear tucked under one arm, a habit she had adopted since Sarah's death, clinging to it as though the fabric could substitute for security. Her small body moved slowly, each step careful, as though conserving energy. Ranger had followed her to the school gate that morning, tail lowered, his thick black and silver coat shimmering with frost. He pressed his nose against her hand before Daniel, already late for his shift, tugged him back toward the car. The German shepherd's ears tilted forward, reluctant to leave her, but he obeyed. His amber eyes, however, remained fixed on the child until the door closed. Inside the classroom, Emily Parker watched carefully. She was in her early 30s, a woman with dark chestnut hair that she tied into a practical bun. Her olive-toned skin flushed easily in the cold. She was not strikingly beautiful in the conventional sense, but carried a quiet strength that drew children to her. A patient smile softened her features, though her hazel-green eyes missed nothing. Emily had grown up in Crestwood as the daughter of a coal miner who had been injured on the job, leaving the family struggling. The hardship had given her empathy for children who lived on the edges of neglect or poverty, and her teaching style reflected it. She noticed details: an untied shoelace, a child's empty lunchbox, the tremor in a voice. That morning, her gaze lingered on Emma, who slipped into her seat at the back, her head bowed. During arithmetic, Emma's pencil slipped from her fingers and rolled under the desk. When she bent to retrieve it, her sleeve slid up, revealing a faint bruise on her wrist. Emily's chest tightened. She kept her face neutral, but inside, alarms rang. She had seen such marks before, subtle enough to be excused, yet telling when, combined with hollow cheeks and downcast eyes. At recess, when the other children streamed into the snow, Emily approached Emma quietly. She crouched to the girl's level, her voice gentle. "Emma, have you had breakfast today?" Emma hesitated, her gray eyes flickering with both fear and hope, then shook her head. Emily reached into her satchel and pulled out a small carton of milk and a packet of cookies she kept for emergencies. "Here," she said softly. "Drink this first. Then eat slowly." Emma's hands trembled as she accepted the food. "It's all right," Emily added, lowering her voice further. "If you need more, I'll ask the cafeteria to save an extra portion for you. You only have to tell me." Emma's eyes, filled with tears, she tried to blink away, and she gave the faintest nod. That evening, Emily wrote a discreet note addressed to Daniel Cross. She had seen him occasionally in uniform, knew of his reputation as a strict but fair officer. The note was brief, expressing concern that Emma seemed hungry and asking him to visit the school if possible. She sealed it carefully, handing it to Emma at dismissal. "Give this to your father, sweetheart," she whispered. Emma tucked it into her pocket without a word. But the note never reached Daniel that night. Victoria intercepted it at the door, plucking it from Emma's hand under the guise of helping with her coat. Later, upstairs, Victoria read it, her lips curving into a smile that was more a bearing of teeth than warmth. She tore it into small pieces and flushed them down the toilet. "No one needs to interfere," she muttered, adjusting her pearl earrings in the mirror. Daniel returned late from his shift, exhaustion dragging his shoulders down. He found Emma already in bed, Caleb asleep beside her. Ranger, however, was restless. The dog paced the hallway, nails tapping on the wooden floor, growling whenever Victoria passed near the children's room. Daniel frowned at his partner's unusual agitation. Ranger was disciplined, rarely aggressive without cause. He knelt to scratch behind the dog's ear, whispering, "What is it, boy?" The German shepherd pressed his head against Daniel's chest, then padded back to Emma's door, planting himself across the threshold like a sentinel. The next morning, Emily decided to try again. She called Daniel's precinct and left a message with the desk sergeant, requesting he come by the school. Daniel received it mid-shift and felt a tug in his chest. That afternoon, still in uniform, he stepped into the school's small office. The warmth of the building was a relief after the icy wind outside. Emily greeted him with a firm handshake, her eyes serious. "Officer Cross, thank you for coming. I'm worried about Emma. She seems undernourished, and yesterday I noticed bruising on her wrist." I thought you should know. Daniel froze, his mind racing. He wanted to dismiss it. Children bruise easily, and Emma had always been delicate, but the words lodged like stones. He remembered Ranger's growls, the silence at dinner, Sarah's recorded warning about Emma's eyes. He cleared his throat. I appreciate you telling me. I'll look into it. His tone was clipped, but Emily caught the flicker of fear behind his professional facade. She placed a hand briefly on his arm, steady and reassuring. Please do. Children often don't speak even when they're hurting. Watch closely. On the drive home, Ranger sat in the passenger seat, head out the window, nose twitching at the cold. Daniel's grip on the wheel tightened. He glanced in the rearview mirror, seeing Emma's small face pressed against the car seat window, her eyes distant. Caleb stirred in his carrier, whimpering. Daniel's thoughts swirled with fragments. Emily's concern, Ranger's unease, Sarah's plea. The threads were beginning to weave together, though the pattern remained incomplete. That night, as the family sat at dinner, Victoria poured wine into her glass, her laughter delicate. Speaking of invitations to a neighbor's party, Emma pushed peas around her plate, avoiding her stepmother's gaze. Ranger growled low whenever Victoria leaned toward Caleb's high chair. Daniel, watching quietly, felt the suspicion settle heavier. Something was wrong, and for the first time, he could no longer push the doubt away. The snowstorm that night had teeth. Wind swept down from the ridges of Crestwood's mountains, rattling shutters and howling against the roofs of the town like a living thing. The cross house groaned in the gale, its windows humming faintly. But inside, it was not the storm that unsettled Daniel. It was silence. After dinner, where Emma had barely touched her food and Victoria had filled the room with the clinking of her wine glass, Daniel had excused himself, pretending fatigue. He retreated to his study, but could not focus on the stack of reports awaiting his review. Ranger paced the hallway outside the children's room, nails clicking softly against the wood, his amber eyes never leaving the door. Something in the dog's constant watch stirred Daniel's nerves, like an itch at the back of his mind. Daniel decided to check on Emma and Caleb before bed. He opened the door slowly, expecting to see both children asleep. Instead, he found Emma sitting upright on her bed, the dim glow of a nightlight illuminating her pale face. Caleb slept in the crib beside her, his breath ragged with a soft whistle. Emma's eyes were wide open, staring down at a small object clutched against her chest. When she saw her father, she startled, quickly shoving it beneath her pillow. Daniel frowned, stepping closer. Emma, it's late. What are you hiding? She bit her lip, shaking her head. Ranger padded in silently, sitting at the foot of the bed, his gaze fixed on the pillow as though he knew what lay beneath it. Daniel sat down gently beside her, lowering his voice. Sweetheart, you don't need to hide from me. He reached under the pillow before she could stop him, his hand closed around a small, worn notebook. The cover blue, edges frayed, the kind of cheap journal often sold at the town's general store. He glanced at Emma, whose storm-gray eyes glistened with tears, then slowly opened the first page. The handwriting was small, shaky, as if written with trembling hands. If I tell, Caleb won't get milk. Daniel froze. He turned the page. She makes me kneel when I ask for more. Another, sometimes she says I must eat less because I don't deserve it. His breath grew heavy, each line pressing like a stone upon his chest. Some pages were nearly blank, carrying only a single broken sentence, the words etched as if with fear itself. If I speak, my brother will starve. Daniel closed his eyes, gripping the notebook until his knuckles whitened. Sarah's voice, recorded months earlier, whispered in his mind, "Don't let the light in her eyes fade." He looked at Emma, whose small frame shook as she tried to hold back sobs. Ranger whined softly, laying his head on the girl's lap, offering the comfort Daniel had failed to provide. The door creaked. Victoria's silhouette appeared in the hall, draped in her silk robe, her blonde hair tumbling in waves around her shoulders, her expression painted with casual sweetness. "What are you doing in here?" she asked softly, but her eyes narrowed when she spotted the notebook in his hands. Daniel rose to his full height, shielding Emma behind him. "Where did she get these ideas?" he demanded, his voice low and sharp. Victoria's smile didn't falter. "Children exaggerate. She's imaginative. You know how dramatic little girls can be." She stepped closer, perfume trailing like smoke, but Ranger growled, baring his teeth. She froze, then rolled her eyes, retreating with a dismissive laugh. "Don't let your past grief make you paranoid, Daniel." She disappeared down the hall, leaving only tension in her wake. Emma clutched Ranger's fur, whispering, "Please don't let her take it away." Daniel knelt, setting the diary back under the pillow, and pressed a hand to his daughter's shoulder. "I won't. I promise." His voice cracked under the weight of guilt. He realized that all the signs had been there: her thinness, her silence, the flinches, the teacher's warning. He had buried his head in duty while his daughter suffered beneath his own roof. To steady himself, Daniel carried Caleb in his arms, holding the boy's fragile body against his chest. The infant stirred but did not wake, his small hand clutching Daniel's collar. Emma followed, Ranger beside her, as Daniel led them down to the living room. He built a fire, its flames snapping loudly, filling the silence with warmth. They sat together on the couch, Daniel in the center, Emma curled against him, Caleb in his arms, Ranger lying across their feet like a sentinel. The moment was fragile, stitched with both sorrow and relief, but it was the first time in many months Daniel felt like a father again. The subplot of The Neighbors returned the following morning. Ellen Carter, carrying another pie, stopped by once more. She found Daniel in uniform at the porch, shadows beneath his eyes. Ellen, though gentle, had the sharp intuition of age. She leaned close, whispering, "I saw Emma yesterday. She looks hungry. Don't ignore it, Daniel." Her voice was firm, maternal. Daniel nodded slowly, his chest heavy with shame, but he said nothing of the diary. Meanwhile, Victoria spent the day weaving her usual facade. She called friends in Denver, arranging to attend a gala next month. Her laughter echoed in the kitchen, crisp and polished. Yet every time she passed the children, Ranger planted himself between her and them, his eyes never leaving her face. Victoria began to notice, muttering under her breath about that mutt. That night, after the children were asleep, Daniel sat at the kitchen table with the diary open before him. He read each entry carefully, the lamplight casting sharp shadows across his face. On one page, Emma had scrawled, "If I stay quiet, maybe she won't hurt Caleb." On another, "Mom said light is in eyes." I tried to keep it. Daniel's throat tightened. He touched the page as ooh, though touching Sarah's hand again. He whispered into the silence, "I failed you." But no more. Upstairs, Ranger's steady breathing echoed down the hall, the rhythm of a guardian keeping vigil. In that rhythm, Daniel found his resolve. The truth was undeniable now, written in the trembling words of his daughter's hand. The battle inside his home had begun, and he knew he could no longer turn away. The following days in Crestwood brought a brittle kind of winter sunlight, weak and watery, slipping between gray clouds as if hesitant to warm the earth. For Daniel, the light felt like a cruel echo of the words in Emma's diary. Each morning, he carried the small notebook with him in his patrol bag, unable to leave it behind. The words were etched into him now, a record of his daughter's suffering inside his own home. At work, he wore his uniform, tall and resolute, but his mind churned with restless guilt. At night, he lay awake listening to the floorboards above, waiting for Ranger's low growl to alert him whenever Victoria moved near the children's room. Ranger had grown more vigilant than ever. The 6-year-old German shepherd rarely left Emma's side, even lying outside the bathroom door when she bathed, his thick black and silver coat rising with every step Victoria took near her. His amber eyes followed her relentlessly, and once, when Victoria tried to take Caleb from Emma's arms, Ranger placed his body between them, baring his teeth in warning. Daniel pretended it was coincidence, but inside he felt the truth. The dog knew, perhaps better than anyone, that something was rotten within these walls. Daniel realized he could not act without proof. Confronting Victoria outright would invite denial and manipulation. He had already seen how quickly she smoothed her tone into silk. He needed evidence, irrefutable and clear. For that, he turned to the one man he trusted, Detective Samuel Harris. Harris was 42, a specialist in family and child welfare cases at the Crestwood Police Department. He was tall, broad in the shoulders, with salt and pepper hair cut short, a weathered face creased at the corners of his eyes, and a voice that carried the gravity of years spent listening to children whisper unspeakable truths. Harris had grown up in a broken home himself, His father, a factory worker prone to rage. His mother, often absent. Those scars had made him patient, compassionate with children, and relentless with abusers. Daniel had worked with him on several cases before, and though Harris was slow to trust, he valued Daniel's integrity. One evening after shift, Daniel asked Harris to meet him in the station garage, away from listening ears. The garage was dim, filled with the scent of oil and cold metal. Harris leaned against the hood of his sedan, arms folded, while Daniel held out the blue-covered diary. "Read this," Daniel said quietly. Harris skimmed a few lines, his jaw tightening. "How long has this been going on?" Daniel shook his head. "Too long. I didn't see it, or maybe I didn't want to." His voice cracked, but he steadied it. "I need help. I need proof, or she'll twist everything." Harris studied him for a long moment, then nodded once. "We'll set cameras. Audio, too. Don't confront her until we've got enough. Keep recording. I'll move on the legal side once we have evidence." That night, Daniel returned home with a box tucked under his arm, discreet surveillance equipment borrowed from the department. After Victoria had gone upstairs to soak in her lavender bath, Daniel worked quickly, his hands steady despite the racing of his heart. He hid one small camera in the corner of the kitchen, angled toward the high chair and table, another in the living room, where Emma often played with Caleb. The devices were silent, no larger than buttons, but they felt like weapons in his fight to reclaim his family. Ranger sat beside him through the process, ears perked, as if understanding the importance of their secret task. Meanwhile, Daniel also began shifting the invisible foundations of their lives. He visited the town bank during his lunch break, dressed in plain clothes, meeting with Henry Collins, a trusted family lawyer in his 50s. Henry was a stout man with thinning sandy hair and wire-rimmed glasses that slid constantly down his nose. Known for his methodical calm, Henry had represented families in Crestwood for decades, his reputation built on discretion. Daniel explained the situation in clipped, careful words, withholding names, but making the urgency clear. Henry nodded gravely. "We'll restrict her access to accounts, move tuition funds for the children into a trust only you control, and revoke her power of attorney." Quietly, of course, papers were drawn, signatures placed. By evening, Victoria would have no financial leverage. At home, life continued on the surface as though nothing had changed. Victoria hosted a luncheon with two neighbors, Mrs. Carter and a younger woman named Denise Myers. Denise was in her late 20s, a single mother with an energetic 5-year-old boy. She was petite, with curly blonde hair and wide brown eyes that often darted nervously, a woman worn thin by balancing 2 jobs. She admired Victoria's elegant clothes, not knowing the cruelty that lay behind them. During the luncheon, Emma hovered in the background, clutching Caleb tightly, her stomach growling quietly. Victoria placed petit four and quiche on the table for her guests, but gave Emma only half a slice of bread. Ranger growled low from under the table, until Daniel, who had returned early, called him away. That night, after the guests left, Daniel retrieved the camera footage. He watched in grim silence as Victoria slapped Emma when she dropped a spoon, then diluted Caleb's milk with water, shaking the bottle and placing it out of his reach as he cried. Every sound, every action was captured. Ranger barked faintly in the background, his frustration palpable. Daniel's chest tightened with rage, but Harris's words echoed in his mind. "Keep recording. Don't confront her yet." The days stretched with unbearable tension. Daniel moved like a ghost in his own home, careful not to betray his knowledge. Emma grew quieter, but when Daniel tucked her in, she clung to his sleeve a moment longer, as though sensing change. Caleb fussed more often, his small body restless, but Daniel held him whenever possible, whispering apologies he could not yet explain. Ranger became a shadow, sleeping by the children's door, refusing food unless Emma fed him, snarling openly whenever Victoria drew near. Daniel knew the trap was set. Each day brought more evidence, more fuel for the fire he would soon unleash. He was a police officer accustomed to evidence and trials, but this was different. This was war inside his own home. And as he looked at his children sleeping under the thin light of their night lamp, Ranger sprawled across the threshold like a sentinel. He swore silently to Sarah's memory. He would not fail again. The night of the dinner party arrived with deceptive calm. Snow had slowed outside Crestwood, falling in delicate flakes that glittered beneath the street lamps. The Cross home glowed warmly from the windows, as if projecting harmony into the cold night. Inside, however, tension coiled like wire. Victoria had orchestrated the evening meticulously. She wore a wine-colored silk gown, her blonde hair styled in soft waves that framed her face with practiced allure. Pearls gleamed at her throat, her every gesture calculated to impress. She had invited several guests, a local councilman and his wife, a banker, and a lawyer from Denver, whom she described as an important friend. The table was set with polished silver, crystal glasses, and carefully folded napkins, while Emma and Caleb sat in the background, deliberately placed to appear as decorative tokens of maternal care. Daniel sat stiffly at the head of the table, his navy wool coat exchanged for a dark suit, though his police badge still rested in his pocket. He said little, allowing Victoria to perform her role. Ranger lay under the table at Emma's feet, his thick black and silver coat brushing against her shoes, his amber eyes watchful. Every time Victoria's hand moved too close to the children, Ranger's tail stiffened and his ears pricked sharply, the warning unspoken but clear. The guests engaged in polite conversation. Councilman Raymond Holt, a stout man in his late 50s with thinning hair and a booming laugh, praised Victoria for her hospitality. His wife, Marjorie, thin and elegant with sharp cheekbones and a voice like cut glass, admired the decor. The Denver lawyer, Richard Coleman, a tall man in his 40s with dark slicked-back hair and a smile too polished to be sincere, leaned back in his chair, surveying the room with the confidence of someone accustomed to controlling outcomes. He was Victoria's trump card, a man she hoped would support her in pushing Daniel toward agreeing to send the children to a boarding school under the guise of better opportunities. As the evening stretched, Victoria glided from guest to guest, her laughter chiming like crystal. But her performance was disrupted by the smallest slip. Emma dropped her spoon onto the floor. The sound clattered louder than it should have in the hushed dining room. Victoria's smile froze. For an instant, her blue eyes flashed with the venom that Daniel had seen too often, a raw expression unguarded. She rose to her feet, moving toward Emma, words forming on her lips. But Ranger moved faster. His bark erupted, thunderous, filling the dining room with shock. He lunged halfway out from under the table, teeth bared, his body shielding Emma and Caleb. Guests gasped, silverware clattering onto plates. The sudden crack in the evening's facade was Daniel's cue. He stood slowly, his tall frame looming, his hazel eyes steady as stone. "Enough," he said, his voice carrying the authority of years on the force. Silence fell. He reached into his pocket and retrieved a small remote. With a click, the television screen on the far wall flickered to life. The hidden camera footage rolled, Victoria slapping Emma across the kitchen, diluting Caleb's milk until the boy cried in frustration, her voice sharp with cruelty. Gasps filled the room. Marjorie Holt covered her mouth, eyes wide with horror. The banker shifted uncomfortably, muttering under his breath. Victoria's face drained of color, then flushed red with fury. "This is staged!" she snapped, her voice shrill. "You edited this. You're trying to ruin me." She lunged for the remote, but Ranger growled, halting her in place. Richard Coleman rose slowly, his polished confidence cracking, though he attempted composure. "Mr. Cross, perhaps we should discuss this privately," he said. But his tone lacked conviction, his gaze darting uneasily to the screen. At that moment, the front door opened and Detective Harris entered with 2 uniformed officers. Harris's presence filled the doorway, his salt and pepper hair catching the light, his eyes narrowed. "We've seen enough," he said firmly. The guests recoiled, whispering among themselves. Victoria whirled, her face twisted, her silk gown rustling like a storm. "You can't do this. You can't make me the villain." But Harris's voice cut through her hysteria. "Mrs. Hayes, you're under investigation for child neglect and abuse. You'll need to come with us." Emma clutched Caleb tighter, tears streaming down her cheeks, but she did not move from her seat. Ranger pressed against her legs, steady as a wall. Daniel's chest ached as he watched his daughter hold her ground with such silent courage. He moved to her side, resting a hand on her shoulder, his voice low. "It's over now." Victoria, handcuffed, shrieked curses as she was led out of the house. Richard Coleman muttered excuses, slipping away quietly, his once polished charm now sullied by association. The other guests avoided Daniel's eyes, murmuring apologies before retreating into the snowy night. In minutes, the glittering dinner party had collapsed into ruins. The living room fell into heavy quiet. The only sounds were Caleb's soft whimpers and Ranger's steady breathing. Daniel knelt before his daughter, meeting her storm-gray eyes, his voice breaking with the weight of his vow. "I should have protected you sooner, but from now on, no one will hurt you. Not ever again." Emma trembled, then leaned into him, her small arms wrapping around his neck. Caleb nestled between them, his tiny hands gripping his father's collar. Ranger sat close, his presence a silent seal on the promise made. In that moment, Daniel felt the first crack of light return to his fractured family. The trap had been sprung, the truth laid bare, and though the road ahead would not be easy, the poison in their home had been expelled. The house that had once been dressed in silence now carried echoes of chaos. The dinner guests had long since fled, leaving only the faint smell of roasted lamb and spilled wine lingering in the dining room. Victoria's angry voice was gone too, silenced by the slamming of the patrol car door as Harris and his officers took her away. What remained was aftermath, a space heavy with tension, but also, for the first time in months, possibility. Daniel closed the front door with a steady hand, turning the lock as though sealing away a chapter of darkness. His shoulders sagged, exhaustion pulling at every muscle, but inside him lived a clarity that felt almost sacred. Emma sat curled on the living room couch, clutching Caleb tightly to her chest. Her storm-gray eyes were wide, flickering like candle flames between fear and hope. She was still trembling from the confrontation, from the voices raised, from the moment Ranger had leapt to shield her. The little boy in her arms whined softly, sucking his thumb, unaware of the magnitude of what had just shifted around him. Ranger lay on the rug in front of them, his black and silver coat glistening in the firelight, ears pricked and body alert, though his head rested on his paws. He seemed to know his job was not yet finished. Daniel knelt before his daughter, the fire's glow throwing lines of weariness across his face. His hazel eyes, once shadowed with detachment, now glistened with unspoken remorse. He placed his large hands gently on Emma's small shoulders, his voice rough but tender. "Sweetheart, I should have seen it sooner. I should have stopped it long ago. But I swear to you, from tonight on, no one will ever hurt you again. Not while I live." Emma blinked at him, tears spilling silently down her cheeks. Her lips parted as if to ask the question that had haunted her for months, and when the words came, they were barely more than a whisper. "Are you going to leave us again, Daddy?" The question sliced through him deeper than any blade. Daniel remembered all the nights he had chosen overtime shifts, hiding in paperwork and patrols, rather than face the emptiness Sarah had left behind. He remembered Emma's eyes at the doorway, waiting for him when he returned late, the way she had shrunk smaller each time he passed her without stopping. His throat tightened, and he pulled both Emma and Caleb into his arms. Caleb squeaked in surprise, then nestled into his father's chest. Daniel whispered, voice trembling, "No, Emma, I'm here. I'm not leaving again." He felt her small shoulders shake against him, not only from fear but from the slow release of it. Ranger stood and stepped closer, pressing his massive head against Daniel's arm, as though sealing the promise himself. His warm breath tickled Caleb's hair, and the baby gurgled softly, reaching his chubby hand toward the German shepherd's muzzle. Ranger licked the child's fingers once, a solemn benediction. Later, when the fire had burned low, Daniel carried both children upstairs. He placed Caleb carefully in his crib, tucking the quilt tightly around him, then helped Emma into her bed. She clutched her worn teddy bear, but for the first time in weeks, she did not pull the blanket over her face in fear. Daniel sat on the edge of the bed, stroking her hair, humming a melody Sarah used to sing, an old Appalachian lullaby that spoke of safe harbors and homecoming. Emma's eyes fluttered, heavy with sleep, and she reached for his hand. "Stay, Daddy." The words, though simple, carried the weight of her entire world. He nodded. "I'll stay." Down the hall, Ranger took his place across the children's doorway, his paws crossed, his amber eyes steady in the dim. He had grown used to keeping vigil against threats from within the house, But tonight, for the first time, his gaze softened. His body relaxed slightly, though he remained ready, the eternal guardian. In the solitude of the master bedroom, Daniel sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the photograph of Sarah on the dresser. Her auburn hair glowed in the picture, her smile luminous, her posture graceful. He whispered, "I almost lost them, Sarah. But I kept your promise tonight. I'll never fail again." His chest ached, but there was a release too, as if her spirit had heard. The subplot of the neighbors stirred again. From across the street, Ellen Carter's window light flickered as she peered out into the snowy night, noticing the patrol cars leaving the cross house. She pulled her shawl tighter, murmuring to herself, "Something has finally changed in that house." Though she did not yet know the details, her instincts told her the children might at last be safe. When Daniel returned to Emma's room later that night, he found both children asleep, their breathing soft and steady. Emma's hand rested on Ranger's back, which rose and fell like the rhythm of a drum. Daniel lowered himself onto the rug beside the dog, leaning against the wall. For the first time since Sarah's death, he allowed himself to close his eyes in his children's presence. The promise had been made, and Ranger's steady breathing was like a sentinel's lullaby. That night, Crestwood's storm broke. The snow fell softer, and for the first time in a long while, the Cross family slept under a roof, free of fear. The quiet that had settled over the Cross home after Victoria's departure felt almost unnatural, as though the house itself needed time to remember how to breathe without fear. For several days, Daniel focused entirely on his children. He rearranged shifts at the precinct, staying home more often, learning the rhythms of Emma's silences and Caleb's cries. The fire crackled each evening, and Ranger patrolled the hallways less as a soldier and more as a watchful guardian, occasionally resting his heavy head in Emma's lap, or placing a paw gently on Daniel's knee, as if to say, "I am still here." For the first time in nearly a year, warmth began to return to the Cross family. But peace proved fragile. One night, as the snow fell thick and heavy against the windows, Caleb grew restless. He coughed sharply, his small chest rising with effort, and when Daniel placed a hand against his forehead, he felt heat. Unnatural, searing. Panic struck him like a blow. Emma stirred from her bed, rubbing her eyes, clutching her teddy bear. "Daddy, what's wrong with Caleb?" she asked, her voice trembling. Daniel swallowed hard, wrapping Caleb in a blanket, his pulse racing. "He's burning up. We need to go." The hospital sat at the edge of Crestwood, a squat brick building with a glowing red cross above its double doors. Inside, the air was sharp with disinfectant, and fluorescent lights hummed overhead. A nurse at the reception desk, young and freckled, took one look at Caleb and waved them forward urgently. Soon they were met by Dr. Leonard Price, the on-call pediatrician. Price was in his late 40s, tall and lean, with thinning sandy hair and deep-set brown eyes behind square spectacles. He carried himself with brisk efficiency, yet his manner softened instantly when he saw Emma's wide, frightened eyes clinging to her father's coat. "Let's take a look at your brother," he said gently, his voice warm enough to disarm a child's fear. Dr. Price examined Caleb carefully, listening to his lungs, checking his temperature. His face grew serious, though not panicked. "It's a high fever, possibly an infection. We'll start him on fluids and antibiotics. You did the right thing bringing him in quickly." He gestured to the nurse, who prepared an IV with steady hands. Caleb whimpered, but Emma held his tiny hand tightly, whispering, "It's okay, I'm here." Ranger lay obediently by the door, his fur damp with melted snow, his eyes never leaving the children. While the IV drip began its steady rhythm, Daniel sank into the hard plastic chair beside the bed. The adrenaline of fear drained from him, leaving behind exhaustion and something deeper, clarity. Watching Emma soothe her brother with words that once belonged to Sarah, he realized his children had lived too long on the edge of neglect and hunger. He remembered the faces of other children he had seen on patrols over the years, small figures in rundown, apartments, kids loitering near the diner, asking for leftover scraps. He had always noted them with professional concern, but rarely with personal urgency. Now, the connection was searing. His own son had nearly slipped away because he had failed to see sooner. How many other children in Crestwood were whispering for help in silence, as Emma once had? Later, when Caleb's fever broke slightly and his cheeks flushed with sweat instead of pallor, Doctor, Price reassured Daniel. He'll recover, but you'll need to be vigilant. Children are resilient, but they shouldn't have to be. The words lodged in Daniel's heart. They shouldn't have to be. Emma had dozed off in the chair beside Caleb's bed, her head tilted against her father's arm. Ranger lay at her feet, his breathing steady, the embodiment of vigilance and loyalty. Daniel stroked Emma's hair absently, staring at the ceiling where shadows flickered from the fluorescent light. In that moment, a seed planted itself in his mind. A place, a refuge, not just for his children, but for others like them. Children unseen, unheard, enduring hunger, fear, neglect. He whispered the thought aloud, almost testing its weight. A haven! His hazel eyes darkened with determination. A haven of hope. The following morning, as Caleb's condition stabilized, Daniel stepped into the hallway to breathe. Snow glittered outside the hospital windows, and for the first time he saw it not as a prison of cold, but as a blank page. Harris arrived then, checking in on his friend. His broad frame filled the corridor, his salt and pepper hair damp from the snow. "How's the boy?" he asked. Daniel exhaled. "Better. He'll recover." Harris studied him closely, recognizing the change in his eyes. "And you?" Daniel looked at him squarely. "I need to do more. Not just for them, for every kid like them. I've seen too much, Sam. It's time to build something." Harris nodded slowly, his expression unreadable but supportive. "Then build it, and I'll help where I can." When Daniel returned to the room, Emma stirred, blinking sleepily. "Is Caleb okay?" she asked. He knelt, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "He's going to be fine," he said softly. "And I promise, Emma, we're going to make sure no child feels the way you did again. Not you. Not anyone." She frowned, confused, but something in his tone comforted her, and she nodded, leaning against him. Ranger lifted his head, thumping his tail once against the floor, as if in agreement. That night, as Caleb rested peacefully under the watchful eyes of machines, Daniel sat at the small desk in the hospital room. He opened his notebook, the one he now carried everywhere, and began to write. His handwriting was firm, deliberate. At the top of the page, he wrote, "Hope Haven, a center for children." Below, he sketched out ideas: shelter, counseling, food programs, legal advocacy. Words poured from him, like a flood held back too long. Emma stirred in her sleep. Caleb sighed in his dreams. Ranger shifted closer to the bed. And Daniel Cross, once a man drowning in grief, began to imagine a future not just for his own family, but for countless others. Spring crept into Crestwood like a quiet visitor, melting the heavy snow that had blanketed the town for months. Streams of water trickled down the gutters, the river broke free of its icy cage, and the bare trees along Main Street began to bud with the faintest hints of green. The Cross home, once a prison of silence, now opened its windows to the fresh air, letting the scent of thawing earth and pine drift inside. For Daniel, each morning felt like more than a season's change. It was as though life itself was learning to breathe again. Hope Haven began as a vision scribbled in his notebook, but quickly became something tangible. With Harris's help, legal forms were filed, and Henry Collins, the lawyer with his steady hands and calm eyes, guided Daniel through the intricate paperwork. Donations trickled in from townsfolk who had whispered for years about their concerns for children, but never knew where to turn. A retired builder named Carl Whitaker, a burly man with thick gray eyebrows and calloused hands, volunteered to help renovate an old brick warehouse near the river. "Kids need a place built solid," he said, his voice gravelly from decades of carpentry. "Something that won't crumble when life shakes it." His words carried into every nail driven, every wall painted. Emma watched the transformation with a mixture of awe and cautious hope. Her storm-gray eyes, once dulled by fear, began to flicker with curiosity again. She followed Daniel and Ranger to the site, sometimes helping carry small paintbrushes, sometimes sitting quietly in a corner, drawing. One afternoon, as sunlight streamed through the newly cleaned windows, Daniel handed her a box of paints. "This wall is yours," he told her gently. "Say whatever you want here. Let it be your voice." Emma stared at the blank expanse for a long moment before writing slowly in large, careful letters, "Family is where no one is left behind." Her hand trembled, but the words were steady, as though Sarah herself had guided them. Ranger lay nearby, his black and silver coat gleaming in the light, tail thumping softly against the floor as if in approval. He had adapted seamlessly to this new rhythm, half watchdog, half comforter. When the children from the community began visiting as renovations neared completion, Ranger became both guardian and gentle giant, allowing shy hands to stroke his fur, standing tall when uncertain parents entered. His amber eyes missed nothing, but his calm presence reassured even the most timid child. Caleb, now nearing his first birthday, began to test his strength. His cheeks had grown fuller, his laughter more frequent, filling spaces that once echoed only with silence. On one warm afternoon, Emma sat clapping her hands, encouraging him to move from the arm of a chair toward Daniel. The boy wobbled, his small legs shaky but determined. Ranger positioned himself like a safety net at his side, his body a wall against any fall. Daniel knelt, with arms wide open, his hazel eyes wet with a mixture of pride and longing. "Come on, son," he murmured. Caleb took one step, then another, before tumbling forward into his father's arms. The room erupted with cheers, Emma squealing with delight, Ranger barking once in triumph, Daniel holding his son against his chest with a laugh that cracked into tears. That evening, the Cross family gathered in their living room. The fire flickered warmly, though the air outside no longer bit with winter's teeth. Daniel sat with Caleb in his lap, Emma curled at his side, Ranger stretched across their feet. On the mantel above them rested Sarah's photograph. Her auburn hair shone even in the still image, her gentle eyes fixed as though waiting for an answer. Daniel stared at it for a long moment before whispering, "I kept my promise, Sarah." The light in her eyes is back. Emma looked up at him curiously but said nothing, sensing the sacredness of the moment. The subplot of community support wove into their days. Ellen Carter brought pies to the renovation site, her white curls bouncing as she scolded Daniel gently. "Don't forget to rest," she said, wagging a finger. Denise Myers, the young single mother, began helping with paperwork, her curly blonde hair pulled back in a messy bun, as she balanced tasks with determination. She admitted one afternoon, "I wish something like this had been around when I was a kid." Her words became another brick in the foundation of Hope Haven. By the time the doors of the center opened officially, spring had fully claimed Crestwood. Children filled the rooms with hesitant laughter that grew bolder by the day. Bright murals painted by volunteers covered the walls, but Emma's words remained the heart of the building. Visitors often paused to read them, some wiping away quiet tears. Family is where no one is left behind. Daniel stood in the main hall one afternoon, watching Emma help Caleb toddle along the rug, Ranger following closely. His chest swelled with something he hadn't felt in a long time, peace. He knew shadows still lingered. The scars on Emma's spirit would not vanish overnight. But light had returned, and light was stronger. For the first time, Daniel no longer felt like a man haunted by loss, but a father building a future. He tightened his grip on Caleb, looked at Emma, then at Ranger sprawled proudly at their feet. "We're home," he whispered, and this time, the word carried no weight of doubt. Only truth. In the end, this story is more than just about a father, his children, and a loyal German shepherd. It is a reminder that even in the darkest nights, God can bring a light of hope that no one can extinguish. Miracles are not always loud or sudden. They are often found in a promise kept, a child's smile restored, or the courage to protect those who cannot protect themselves. And just like in this story, each of us in our daily lives can be that miracle for someone, a neighbor, a friend, or even a stranger in need. If this touched your heart, I invite you to share it with someone who might need hope today. Leave a comment with your thoughts, and if you believe in God's protection and miracles, write Amen in the comments. Do not forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories of faith, love, and redemption. May God bless you and your family with peace and strength every single day.